Okay, so in today's video, we will be discussing on subqueries, right? So let's start with what is subqueries. What is subqueries? So subqueries are like query inside a query, right? So we have something called as outer query here, which is our final query, and we have a inner query, which output of which is used as the input or feeder for output query or outer query, right? So basically we will have two queries here, query inside a query. So the inner query will give us a result set, and this result set will be the input for the outer query, which will be our final select query. So this is what is meant by a subquery. So in most of the cases, inner query is independent of outer query, right? Means both the queries can function individually. In one specific case, which is in case of correlated queries, correlated subqueries, right? In case of correlated subqueries, the inner query is dependent on outer query. Okay, example of correlated subquery is when we use the exist clause. Right? So we'll discuss all this in details. We'll see the syntax of a normal subquery, and then we'll see the syntax of a correlated subquery. Okay, so how do we write it? So as I said, there will be two queries. One query we will consider as the outer query, and one query we will consider as the inner query. So let's write the syntax. So let's say select. We can either give select star or select specific column names, right? From, let's say, table 1. So this table 1 and this select statement is our outer query, which will give us the final select result. So then we will have a filter condition, which is where, and then we will have the filter column or a group of columns on which we want to apply filter, right? And then we will have what? An operator. And we discussed what are the operators. It can be equal to, it can be greater than, it can be less than, it can be not equal to, right? And it can be multi-row operators like in, or it can be correlated subquery expression called exists, right? These are the operators. And after these operators, we will have one more select query, which will be under the brackets, select call names from table 2. And here also you can have some filter conditions. So when we write a query like this, right, this is called as a subquery, and this query will act as inner query. So whenever we execute a subquery, first it will execute this query. So this query will give us the input, and this output, and this output will be the input to this filter columns, which is essentially the column from table 1, and we will select the data from table 1 based on this filter, which is the output of this inner query. This is the generic syntax of subqueries. Clear on this?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. So the syntax for correlated subquery is a bit different. So we will copy this part. In this, you observe this statement is independent of this outer query. Means there is no link between the outer query and inner query. And if you just execute this statement, it will give you results, right? So in case of correlated subquery, there is a dependency on the outer table in the subquery. So that's why you cannot execute this inner query standalone. Means if you run this query alone, it will fail. So in case of correlated subquery, the only operator that we use is the exist operator, right? So I will remove this operator part. It says exist. So we use this to check if there are some data from table 1 on a particular set of columns which is present in table 2 or not. So in those kind of scenarios, we use the exist keyword, and it will be something like where table 2 dot filter column equal to table 1 dot filter columns, right? So when we write a query subquery like this, so if you see in this select statement, we are using a where condition, and we are comparing the filter columns from table 2 with the filter columns from table 1. And where is the table 1? It is our outer query. So if I just run this query, it will fail because it will not find a reference to table 1, and it will say invalid table reference or unable to find this filter columns because it is coming from a table which is outside this brackets, right? So this is how a correlated subquery is written. So the inner query will be dependent on the outer query, and you cannot, execute the inner query standalone, unlike the case that we do in normal subqueries. And the only operator that we can use with correlated subquery is the exist operator, right? Clear on the concepts of or the syntax of the subqueries and the correlated subqueries?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. So next we are going to discuss the types of subqueries, right? So there are essentially 5 types of subqueries, right? The first one is single row subquery. So in case of single row subquery, what happens? We'll just consider this syntax for time being. In case of single row subquery, this particular inner query will return only one row, 1 or 0 records, right? So we will either get 1 record from this particular query or we will get 0 records when the condition is not matching, right? And when we use single row subquery, we can use these operators, right? Equal to, greater than, less than, not equal to, and greater than equal to, and less than equal to. We can use these operators with single row subquery, and this inner query will only return us 1 record. Okay, so the second type is multiple row subqueries. So in case of multiple row subqueries, what will happen is, if we consider this syntax, the inner query will now return, more than 1 or 0 records. Either it will return null or it will give more than 1 records, right? And when you have this kind of subqueries, multi-row subqueries, when you have more than 1 records as the inner query output, you cannot use a equal to condition. In this case, we go with operators like in, right? Not in. And we saw this in operator earlier, right? We can check for multiple values for a column using in. So whenever we use a multi-row subquery, that means inner query will give us more than 1 result. Then we have to use in and not in, or we can use like all or any as the operators. We cannot use operators like equal to, greater than, less than. This we cannot use. Okay, Clear on this? We'll see examples of each of them. So that will, make it more clear for you. So the third one is multiple column subquery. So what it means is, if we consider the syntax again, right? We are selecting some columns from table 1. So the inner query will have more than one column. Let's say you're selecting column 1, right? Column 2 and column 3 from your inner query. And these columns can have, one row or multiple row. So based on that, you can decide the operators. It can either be equal to or it can be in, right? So inner query will more than one column in output data set. So when in this case we are having 3 columns as the output from the inner query, right? So your filter column should be like this: column 1, column 2, column 3, and then the operator that you want to use, right? So basically, if in multi-column subquery, what happens, if you're returning n number of columns from the inner query, you should make sure you match each of these columns in the filter condition. So in the filter condition also, you should be having n number of columns, right? So this is how multi-column subquery works, and the order of these columns should be exactly same. So if you're selecting column 1, column 2, column 3, in your where condition also, you need to give it in the same order, like column 1, column 2, column 3. If you give column 2, column 1 and column 3, so it will compare this column 1. So if you make it like this, column 2 or column 1, it will try to compare this value with column 2 value, which will not match again, right? So we need to be very careful here and make sure the order in which the columns are selected from the inner query should match the order of the columns which we are giving in the filter condition, basically after the where clause. Clear on this?
Yes, bro.
The
Yes.
fourth type is correlated subqueries. And we have seen the syntax for that. Let me copy this. So in correlated subquery, what happens? Inner query is dependent on outer query and vice versa, right? So inner query is dependent on outer query, and the outer query is anyways dependent on the inner query to get the results, right? So both tables or queries are dependent on each other. So this is called as correlated subqueries. The fifth and the last type is nested subqueries. So what it means, if we consider this scenario, we have a syntax, right? Let's remove where column 1, let make it column 1, and we have a filter condition here, right? So this filter condition will be like equal to, and we have a third layer of subquery now here, right? Select column 1 from table 3 where some condition. So when we write it like this, what we did here, we added one more subquery inside this subquery. So this was our first subquery, which is table 2, but now table 2 is dependent on the output of table 3. So in this case, when we have subquery inside a subquery, we call it nested subquery. So in this case, inner query will have one more subquery, one or more subqueries associated with it. So clear on these concepts? This is basically subquery inside subquery. You had a subquery which is also on table 2. This was your inner query for table 1, and table 3 becomes the inner query for table 2. Clear on this concept of nested subqueries?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are on the definition of subquery, how many types of subqueries we have, and what are the